Welcome everybody. My name's Phil Harding and I started in the music industry in 1973, believe it or not, as a 16-year-old runner T-boy at the Marquee Studios. And I often say to people and to students, I kind of did a 4 or 5 year course as an unofficial apprenticeship at the Marquee Studios. Because courses like this, we're here at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. May as well credit the university. These courses didn't exist. You know, if I was your age now, I'd be on one of these courses, definitely. But it was a good 4 or 5 years until I was kind of let loose on the console with clients. So I relate that to being kind of a 2-year start point when you're 16, whether you choose to stay on at school and do A-level music, I know that's become very unpopular, or go to an FE college and show that you know what you want to do. I'm talking from an industry perspective now, you know, when you run through what you studied when you're going into industry, and do a 2-year music production or music technology course, and then come on to an undergraduate course like this. I do recommend that it's worth going on to an MA after this, from the point of view of how industry looks at that. So I started off as a runner, assistant engineer, some people call us a tape jockey, you know, and I was in this kind of back room with all the tapes. I didn't have a white coat on, but I was controlling the tape machines on an intercom to the control room, so I wasn't even in the main control room initially, and I'd be running around setting up microphones, providing tea and coffee for the clients and the musicians, and running out and getting sandwiches. So it was kind of a system of watching how everything worked. After 2 years, we did actually move into the control room and put the tape machines in the control room so I could see exactly what was going on with the engineers and producers. So amongst the early clients I was let in on, so that was 73, so by the late 70s we hit the, amongst other things in genres, we hit the punk revolution. And one of the things with punk bands is they refuse to work with corporate rock producers who had been successful before. So they would say to their labels, put me in a studio with a young engineer and we'll produce it ourselves. So amongst the first engineering sessions I did, believe it or not, was with The Clash. And I did a mixing session for White Man in Hammersmith Palais, and then I went on and recorded 4 tracks for their 10-inch album just before London Calling. Anyway, so there I was as a young engineer thrust into this situation where I'd been used to seeing, you know, the engineer here controlling the console, producer there, band out in the studio, and suddenly the producer's chair was empty. So this was a kind of an early learning curve for engineers like myself, and kind of the birth of the creative engineer co-producer that you see on credits now for bands like Coldplay and Kaiser Chiefs and so on, you know, where you've got a good creative technical engineer that's actually co-producing with the band. So that still exists, and that grew from that. So after The Clash, I did do a lot of pop things, but I also recorded and mixed the whole of the first Killing Joke album, which is now pretty legendary. And not long after that, I met Pete Waterman, before he got together with Stock and Aitken, and worked with him and Peter Collins. That was his previous partner. And I was still at the Marquee Studios. I was a house engineer. I was on a wage. That doesn't really exist unless you're in TV or film maybe and things like that. But music producers, music studios don't really pay engineers a wage anymore. Everybody's freelance. So that was a great experience for me. And by 84, we had spent about a year at the Marquee when Pete Waterman got together with Stock and Aitken. We did the Dead or Alive Spin Me Round record and the whole of that Youthquake album that it came from. And that gave Pete Waterman the confidence and finance to go forward and start running in his own studio in South London. I went along as chief engineer. I was persuaded to leave the Marquee, and it was at that point that basically Pete said to everybody, the only person I'm going to pay is the studio manager and receptionist. Everybody else is going to have to become freelance. And that became common throughout the 80s. You know, now we're all freelancers and self-employed and so on, generally in this side of the industry. After the success with Dead or Alive, I spent until 1992 there, you know, best part of 8 years or more, working with Bananarama, Rick Astley, Kylie Minogue, Jason Donovan, all those sort of people. Some of it production, but mainly engineering and mixing. And I got a reputation as a mixer more than a recording engineer, although obviously I was capable of doing all of that. So I partnered up with Ian Curnow at that time, and we became the kind of Stock Aitken Waterman B team. And by 92, things had gone down a little bit with that kind of sound. People had got fed up with it as we went into a new decade, you know, and we got Britpop and acid house and all the rest of it. So Ian and I moved on to our own studio at a place called the Strong Room, which still exists. And that was one of the first places in London that had, you know, some studios like this, but it created anywhere between 8 and 10 production rooms, a bit like your small production rooms you've got here down the corridor, where teams like us could go in and hire the room. So it's soundproofed, we'd generally equip it ourselves, air-conditioned, and we could work on our own projects, just paying rent, basically, you know, on a yearly basis, and then got a preferential rate to go in and mix in their mix rooms and use the bigger studios if we needed it. So so we kind of went from SAWB team to the A team, as it were, for a guy called Tom Watkins. So I've always kind of worked, certainly in those days, under the guide of someone experienced and established in the industry. You could call them an entrepreneur. Tom Watkins in the 80s had signed the Pet Shop Boys, Bros, and at the point we started working with him, he had signed E17. So we went on through the 90s, E17, Boyzone, 911. We became boy band producers, basically, and songwriters, and had a nice team around us. Produced a lot of tracks on the first 3 E17 albums, including Stay Another Day, that comes around every Christmas. Keeps me going, marvellous. And then by the end of the 90s, I got, I like to say, boy banded out. You know, we'd been kind of, in terms of the industry, they considered that that's all we did. You know, regardless of the fact that my partner Ian had done a world tour with Talk Talk in the 80s, and you know, I'd worked with the Clash and people like that and so on. You know, we had a good rock history as well as everything else. And it was getting to me, you know, after nearly 20 years of hardcore manufactured pop, it was and the 8 years of nothing but boy bands and male voices, I kind of needed to break out. And that's when I first got into education. So that leads us towards here. I was one of the co-founders of J.A.M.E.S, Joint Audio Media Education Services, which accredits this course that you're on, one of the reasons I'm here today. And we're still going strong. It's all industry professionals that come around and do the visits, and we give support to the courses and the course leaders and so on. And throughout that sort of, you know, 20 plus years since I started getting involved then, I've got my own studio at home, as most professional producers and engineers have. I've kept my hand in by doing work such as I'm going to show you today. And I've got a strong dedication towards education, because I think people that have managed to have a career in the industry like myself, there's a feeling at a certain point that you want to give back, you know, and that's part of the process of what we do. So I'm a pretty good example of my motto, which is in my first book. I'll show you my second book in a minute that this comes from, which is find your passion, make it your profession, and you'll never have to do a hard day's work in your life. And I'm a pretty good example of that. I never really felt like I'd worked hard. I mean, obviously I did all sorts of crazy hours and all sorts of, but if you're working in something you enjoy, as you guys are studying for, then it's an entirely different attitude to doing something you don't want to be doing. So that's important to me, and I would say that I probably never did a hard day's work until I became a part-time lecturer at West Suffolk College in Bury St Edmunds, and I've got full sympathy for your course directors and everybody that's helping you through the course, because there's a lot of administration, especially now behind the scenes, that is very difficult to cope with if you've not done a lot of that before. Anyway, that leads us on to now. So I'm going to go through my top-down 12-step mixing guide. Thanks for that little title. Do we know what top-down is? Who wants to stab a guess at that?
Well, funnily enough, we've just learnt this, so we should get it right.
Yeah.
It's kind of a more macro version of mixing as opposed to kind of surgically going in on each track.
That's interesting. Well, I wouldn't say you're wrong, but it's not what I call top-down mixing.
Right.
What I call top-down mixing is starting with the vocals. Because traditionally, going way back in the industry from the 60s and 70s onwards, we would start with drums, upwards to the vocals. And it was in the 90s, working with bands like E17, where we had, 4 members of the band all singing and being multiple tracked, and session singers. When I mixed Stay Another Day at the Strong Room, I had something like, a lot of it was submixed, but there was something like 60 vocal tracks there. And my feeling was, well, if I really think about what I'm doing here in terms of servicing the client, and the client being the record company, the media, obviously the band, and the fans, the main focus there, certainly for a boy band and for a pop act, is generally the vocals. So why don't I get the vocals right first and then work my way down to the drums? So I would recommend, if you haven't tried that, macro mixing sounds interesting, but I am going to focus on individual things here. Then I would say give it a go. If you take nothing else from the day and from this session, then give that a go and see how it works out for you. Because I find that's, for me, the only way to mix now. So the whole 12-step program is in this book, Pop Music Production, available everywhere, published by Routledge. It came out of my PhD. I kind of skipped over that. I did a PhD at Leeds Beckett University, and they allowed me to do a PhD on manufactured pop and boy bands of the 1990s. So it's quite a rare academic book about cheesy pop, because generally in academia, people write about much cooler music than what I've been involved in.
Can I just say as well,
Yep.
even if you're not into cheesy pop, that book and its predecessor will be one of the best things you can ever buy. I've been doing this 35 years, not anywhere near the level of Phil, but they are so packed full of information. So really highly recommended that you go and pick those up. Sorry, Phil.
Thanks, Mark. Always good for a plug.
Yeah, they're seriously, they're really good.
Yeah, so my previous book is about my period at the 80s, PWL from the factory floor. That's only available from my website, philhardingmusic.com. That's all the plugging done with. So the aim of this session is to encourage you to think about what I call mixing top down. Try it yourselves. Same goes for anybody viewing this at home. If you haven't tried it, give it a go. It's interesting. Obviously, you need something that's got vocals on it. Ideally, something that's got quite a few vocals on it to deal with. And one of the interesting things for me is that by the time you get down to the drums, they seem a lot less significant than if you go bottom up. Because we can spend hours as engineers working on drums, different sounds, different effects, etc., etc. And what I found in the past is that you can lose sight of the song by spending hours just on the drums. Good that you're being taught to kind of do it in a different way, where sounds like you're hearing lots of things together rather than just starting like that. So that's good advice. So I'm going to show you a project that I did about 7 or 8 years ago with the wonderful Belinda Carlisle. I'll talk more about the actual project and how it came about as we go through. But let's get into the technical stuff. You should have, as well as everything I'm going to talk about with the effects I use and the way I use them, and my mode of operanda, the way I work. I like to say that it's, for you guys, it's a bit like, filling an imaginary toolbox. I do believe that as an engineer and producer, you've got to have an amount of things that you're confident with, an amount of tools and processing that you feel confident with. So that may not be what I show you today, but obviously I'm confident with everything I'm showing you. So one of the start points, I mean, a lot of this project in particular, but a lot of projects I've done in the last 10 years tend to start in Logic Pro. Because it's so easy for programming, it's fine for recording. But I tend to, with the projects I've done, and you know, a lot of industry people do this, also in the sound design world and the film world, come out of Logic Pro once you've got everything done and come into Pro Tools. So one of the fantastic things about Logic Pro is whether it's MIDI or audio, you can highlight everything you've got there in your program and export it as individual WAVs. And I won't be too derogatory about Logic, but to me, by the time I get what I've worked on a long time in Logic into Pro Tools, individually, the tracks sound better. You know, there's a lot of industry people that tend to think that, you know, I'm being quite politically incorrect, I suppose. I don't know, but a lot of people in the industry, like myself, and maybe it's the people that are more of my experience, that if you're doing an entirely analog, almost tape machine type recording, Pro Tools from the start point is great. If you're doing a lot of programming and using a lot of MIDI things as well as audio, then Logic is a great start point, and I don't think Pro Tools can beat that. So therefore, what I recommend is you have a template that you're going to import all of this audio into, and I soon learnt that you know, it's much quicker if I have a standard template as my start point. I'll copy it into a new project folder so that as I import the audio, it all becomes that individual project. So it's just a very simple Pro Tools template that's continually being copied and hovering around, you know, on my drives. So I thought I'd show you that first. So I've got auxiliary tracks, what I call groups traditionally, you know, on a mixing desk: drums, bass, guitar, keys, lead voice, etc. And I've got all of my general effects that I know I'm going to use: a vocal plate, a longer plate, drum ambience, 4s, 8s delays, extra delays, the Dimension D. You know, I've been very much a person that's worked to this kind of formula for a long time, since the 80s. There's plenty of engineers and producers out there that totally disagree with this type of thing and feel that all of these effects should be set up individually for the track when you approach it. You know, it's up to you. The thing is, this saves a lot of time. Yeah. So, so are we all clear on that? You're going to go away and get your own mixing template going. You know, even if you don't use the groups, just having all the effects there ready to go on the various buses is going to save you time rather than, you know, booting it up as you go. So, and I always, the other thing I will say, and you'll see it when I open up the main program, you know, I always come in next to the MIDI track, obviously set the tempo, go from bar 1, beat 1. And what we've learnt with the team that I was working with this, if you actually take the time in Logic to put numbers before the name, everything will appear in Pro Tools as you've been watching it on Logic. So kick 1, snare 2, etc. And I've been working with some professionals recently who just don't do that. I mean, certainly on a film project I worked on, they've got very specific file systems and naming that they work to, and you're kind of forced into that. But, you know, if you're in control of the project or you've got any control of what's coming in, the number system is very good.
Been through the whole, like, DAW revolution.
Yeah.
How was it from your perspective? Because you started with tape, now you're doing stuff with computers.
Yeah, well, you know, what we have now, it's an excellent question, you know, is a dream come true. You know, we couldn't have imagined when we only had Ataris and other machines working with Logic and Cubase being MIDI only. And the dream was to combine MIDI and audio. And I can't emphasise enough how important that was in the early 90s. And in fact, the first project, the first mix we worked on, 317, 1992, I can highlight it to there. You know, we were working on Cubase. My partner Ian Kerno was a Cubase beta tester. And we had, the first time they came off the Atari and into Apple Macintosh, he came along to the studio with a prototype where we had an interface with 4 channels working with MIDI. But of course, it kept falling over. But it was like, to us, that was the start of the future, as we are now in, and revolutionary. I mean, the thing I've discussed about, this door sounds better than that door and stuff like that. I mean, that's all your personal taste and down to you. But the great thing about Pro Tools, because it was one of the early ones, coming away from Cubase. I mean, Cubase for us was a big thing, and that's what we programmed almost everything in for 8 years. But in its early design, it seemed to be designed for experienced sound engineers, and I'm quite shocked really that the other sequencers don't copy at least this mix page, because it certainly feels to me as an experienced engineer, I mean, you've just got to look at that and look at that, and it looks very similar. But I don't know any other DAW that does that. I mean, Logic have got closer, but it's hard to explain when you've been using something for a long time and you've got used to it. So, but it's back in the early 90s, it was an unimaginable but wanted future, and we take it for granted somewhat that we're here now with that future.
Trying to sync MIDI to tape machines.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so step one. Let's, so exactly as I said to you, I've imported all of this audio. You can see lots of numbers, 26, 37, etc. So all my voices have ended up down this end. Here's all my effects channels on buses 1 through to 7 there. And my various auxiliary channels, or as I call them, groups. This one is controlling the voices, the keys, etc., etc. So, to me, it's a very logical system. And again, going back to tradition, I start with the drums. So the kick, the kick is number 1, snares number 2, etc. So there's some very simple basics and ideas to take with you. So how does one start with just the lead voice? So what I found is that you really do need, even if you're not going to use it in the final mix, some kind of constant keyboard pad or a constant instrument throughout the track. Could be a guide. Simple thing is to just always get my co-producers or keyboard programmers to do a simple pad. Could be a guitar that goes throughout if it's a guitar-based project, so that you've got something to relate the lead vocal to. Yeah. So I'm soloing the lead vocal. I'll always start off at 0 with my master fader at 0. So I'm just trying getting a standard start bass. They very rarely end up there. And
someone told me long ago,
what are we on there?
There's a calm before the storm. I know it's been coming for some.
So I've got a musical relationship between the lead voice and that little pad there that just helps me to kind of keep a focus on where the song's going rather than just an a cappella vocal, out into nothing. So what have I got on that vocal? I'm a big fan of Universal Audio plugins, and they do a lot of plugins that, again, to me as an experienced engineer, really close. Their R&D is fantastic, really close to the originals. This was always my favourite compressor, DBX 160, one of the simplest compressors ever made and on the market. And I've always got a start point of 3-to-1 ratio. And pretty much every time I bring up a compressor, whichever compressor it is, I just learned in my early days, if you start at a 3-to-1 ratio, you might want to go higher than that to really compress something heavy. And sometimes, I think when we get to the bass, I come down to 2-to-1, because I find that above 2-to-1, very subtly, it can take some of the bottom end away. But that's always my start point. And this chain is quite important, because if you have your equalizer first, the EQ is going to affect the compressor. And I don't want to be doing that. So DBX 160 first.
Someone told me long ago,
The threshold set.
there's a calm before the storm. I know.
Just to control the level. It's probably been recorded without a compressor So that's why. And then we come to my favourite EQ, Focusrite, the D2 series. Delighted that we've got this to show you today. You know, Focusrite, well-known manufacturer. This is the Avid version of it. It's not Universal Audio. But again, you need to think about. Sometimes you're going to need different equalisers on different things. But what I like about using Focusrite a lot, every time I open up an EQ on different channels, you're going to see the D2 keep popping up. Is it's a bit like having a Focusrite mixer in front of you. You know, when you're back working on an analog mixer, you're generally working with the EQ that's on the channel. The Audience Marvelous, I do like it. SSL, I worked on for years. I generally don't use their plugins, you know. I know it's considered a classic now, but actually I was never keen on it at the time until it at least got to the G series. What I love about the Focusrite is that it's very subtle. You know, I've got 8 dB going in at 10K, but you know, it's not sounding too harsh or too bright. It's very smooth. And the difference between that and I have kind of, in case the Focusrite didn't work out, I have doubled up on the EQ, on the internal Avid EQ, and it's a lot harsher. I don't know how well we can demonstrate that today. I'll have a go quickly.
Someone told me long ago, there's a calm before the storm. I know.
So there's the Focusrite.
It's been coming for some time.
Go back to the same section.
Someone told me long ago, there's a calm before the storm. I know.
It's slight. To me, it's slightly harsher. It's subtle. But anyway, that's my preference. That's my go-to, is the Focusrite EQ. And typically, I'm going to talk about, we could spend an hour talking about EQ. We're not going to do that. We're going to try and charge through most things. But it's been recorded fairly flat. So I've got what I would call typical EQ for a vocal. I've got 8 dB at 10K, 6 dB at 5K, and I'm cutting out at 400. Now, this is one of my main gripes of EQ. I don't know if you've discussed it in your lessons and so on, but to me, anything between kind of 300 and 900 hertz is a dangerous frequency in terms of ever boosting it. Not saying you shouldn't, you could, but in my view, I call it the box frequency. It sounds very boxy if you actually boost it. So you'll see continually I'm taking that kind of frequency out, somewhere between 3 to 900. I don't know if we can hear that on here.
Someone told me long ago, there's a calm before the storm. I know.
A lot smoother when it's cut a bit rather than boosted drastically. You know, sounds like we recorded her in a cardboard box. That's easier to demonstrate on drums. But funnily enough, I felt we were lacking a bit of warmth. So I've boosted 2 dB at 150 hertz. You know, much lower. So boosting the top end, boosting a little bit of warmth down there, and cutting around the low mids. And you'll see that system working quite a lot. So, and then, you know, many would say this is unnecessary. I still like to check if the S's and T's are too harsh. I will still put a de-esser in line. But it's a bit of an old school thing. We used to have to do it when everything was going to vinyl. Vinyl's coming back, you know. How it affects the kind of level that you can get onto vinyl. If you've got distortion going on in your sibilants on a voice, the vinyl has to be cut at a lower level. So you know, I think it's still worth bearing in mind. So that's going in at 9.7K, and we should see it move.
Someone told me long ago,
just pulling back on the S's and T's.
There's a calm before the storm. I know.
Helping to keep it smooth. Now you can hear that there's reverb effects on there. My main voice plate, believe it or not, I still use a deverb. Internal Avid, I really like it. It's a bit scummy sounding, for want of a better word. But this project was part of a sort of retro 80s project of a whole album of artists like Belinda Carlisle doing covers like this song, Have You Ever Seen the Rain? There was a marketing survey done by a South American record label, and the view was from fans was that they wanted to hear their favourite 80s artists sounding like they did in the 80s, but on some new recordings and all covers. It didn't sell very well. Belinda was one of the biggest artists that took part. Myself and my team produced 2 or 3 tracks on the album. And the interesting thing about this reverb is that when I first sent a mix through of Curiosity Killed the Cat, the executive producer, Robin Miller, who used to produce Sade, you know, famous 80s producer, and he owned studios, I had the much smooth... Well, let me just let you know that that's a large plate at 3.1 seconds with 50 milliseconds pre-delay. But I would have sent him the lead voice with the Lexicon 224. This is another Universal Audio plugin. Fantastic. You know, they were amongst the first digital reverb units that we had back in the 80s. When they went on to the next level, the number of which was the Lexicon 480, thank you, Mark. The 224 began to sound a bit cheap and scummy. It was like, you know, that's their first attempt. But Robin thought that this was interesting. He picked up that I'd used something that he thought sounded too classy, because as good as Universal Audio get things, they're going to make it sound as clean and as classy as possible. And actually, the 224 wasn't. So I sent the same mix back to him, swapping out the Lexicon 224 for the Deverb, which sounds cheap and scummy. And he said, great, that's it. That sounds more like the 80s.
You got the rust on the tape.
You know, couldn't believe it. So, sorry, so I went through that very quickly, didn't I? So to me, use what you want, but a good start point is a 3-second plate. You know, I would very rarely use anything other than a copy of a reverb plate, an old, you know, which was a metal plate that was in a massive wooden box. Have you got one here at the uni? Can't remember. No, you haven't. You know, with a signal going in one end and a pickup at the other end that physically, remotely could be moved along. You know, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. They didn't go much more than 3 or 4 seconds, I don't think.
3 was the top.
Yeah. So for me, that's just something I'm used to as a vocal. But a little bit of 50 millisecond pre-delay in there, that's just so that hopefully the vocal is initially hitting us fairly dry, and 50 milliseconds later, the reverb's kicking in. So that's on the lead vocal. Also on the lead vocal is, again, just the Avid internal 4's delay. So it's just in sync with the tempo, and I've got feedback of 42%.
Someone told me long.
Yeah. And what I find is on a vocal, I always do this on a lead vocal, just subtly. You know, there might be some words that you pick out, you know, where you really want to hear it a lot more as an effect. But I find that helps to bed the vocal into the rhythm of the track. So you won't really hear much of that delay, you know, when the whole track's going. But for me, it's helping me to bed it in. And then the last thing that I put on a vocal, and I don't generally add this until the end of the mix, and I've done it again. This is what I call my secret weapon for by the time you've got everything in and you feel that the vocal is still not quite sitting on top of the track, which ideally is what you want in pop, I put some of this old boy on it, Dimension D, the most subtle chorus ever made by Roland or anyone else. And it's got 4 different dimensions, dimension 1 being the most subtle. And what it does, I use it on a lead vocal and I use it on bass, is it brings a mono signal into full left and right and tends to just bring it forward in the dimension of the stereo soundscape. So, you know, we are hearing that, but again, a bit even more subtly than the delay. I mean, if I send more of it, Let's bring that over this time. We will get beyond verse one day.
Someone told me long ago, there's a calm before the storm. I know.
So
It's been coming for.
So rather than reaching for the lead vocal fader, I'm putting a subtle effect on that's putting her into the full stereo. I mean, obviously, you know, the reverb is stereo. By the way, the delay, that forced delay I've put on, is mono up the middle, because I find unless you deliberately want a stereo delay of some kind going across speakers, I will tend to fix my delays to where the audio is that's going to them. Yeah. Okay, that pretty much completes my lead vocal setup. You know, quite a few things there, and that's duplicated on other vocal tracks. So if I go to the chorus,
I wanna know,
double track.
have you ever seen the rain?
So I've got the shorter reverb on the lead, and on the double track, and probably some of the backing vocals, when we get to them, I've got this longer reverb on the 224. I know it looks like it's only 2 seconds, but the mid decay is actually 3.4. And sometimes I'll go further than that. I won't go into how you operate a lexicon. It's quite complex, but it's fun. And there's a lot of choice there of controlling all the reverb effects. So what else have we got vocal-wise? We've got some harmony parts that Belinda put on, and I'll talk about that once I've done the BVs.
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain? I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
It's used very low in our final mix, as you'll hear when we get there, because before we got to the session, we had not chock-a-block, but we had a backing track of drums, keyboards, guide bass, etc. But we had laid out our backing vocals, which I'm going to show you next, with a session backing vocalists that were very much designed to go with the song and with the music of the keyboards. In other words, you work out what the chord is, and you go to the chord rather than necessarily the melody, as Belinda's done. Belinda's moved around with the melody. But Belinda, she had that in her head. She wanted to go and sing it. So quite rightly, democratically, you record it, because the main thing you want is for your artist to walk out of the studio door happy, not get into a tiff about, we've already got all these backing vocals. So, but just to show you on that chorus, what we've done backing vocal wise, and I will break them down a bit. Unison.
Have you ever seen the rain?
We were just looking to pick out those.
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
One of the things in pop I've found across years, and I'm not any kind of musical theory expert, but if you harmonise, certainly as we got there, 3-part, every single line of a chorus, it becomes a bit country. If you're doing country music, that's fine. But in pop, we generally harmonise the lines that we want to emphasise as being the main hook in the chorus. Yeah, so that's why the first line is, we've got 4 tracks of unison from the session vocalist, and then we've got 2 harmony lines. We did, in fact, have 3. On the title, Have You Ever Seen the Rain?
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain? I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
And all these were recorded before Belinda. So, again, they're going through a 160 compressor, the backing vocals.
I wanna know,
Oh, quite hard.
have you ever seen the rain?
Yeah. Internal EQ, much as I've already described, you can see it on the screen there. Boosting top end, cutting out low mid, and actually cutting out low end. So there's no rumbling going on. And we've got one We've got 2 reverbs on there. We've got the D-verb, same as a lead vocal. We've got the 2-2-4, same as a double track vocal. And instead of 4s, it's going to 8s. So I'm trying to give everything its own space and not too much of the similar processing, or at least some sort of different processing to other things. And the important thing is that all the lead vocals and everything Belinda's done are hard up the middle, and these are variously panned around her. So I'm keeping the centre space for the lead and putting all the backing vocals to the side. Any questions on that before we move on?
What do the third vocals sound like? Because you've muted them.
This one, it's an extra harmony that we decided not to use. I'll show you, yeah. Oh, well.
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
What's that?
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
That was, well, if I show you the other ones, hopefully you'll see why I haven't used it. Have you ever seen the rain? And these 2 are...
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
very close to each other. I mean, if I bring that back in.
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
I mean, they're 2 different harmonies. They work, but by the time we got Belinda on, because these were recorded before Belinda. So, and Belinda wasn't really singing to these, but we knew that they would work. It was kind of a guide of how we heard the chorus phrased, and we knew that it would work musically. If I just show you the last 2, just for the...
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
The obvious third above.
I wanna know,
So that was enough, really, with
have
those.
you ever seen the rain?
Yeah. And then the interesting thing is, if I put Belinda's harmony in with it,
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
she's kind of...
I wanna know,
We didn't want that harmony there,
have
but
you ever seen the rain?
she's crossing in between the harmonies that we've done, which are very much sticking to the chord. Yeah, that's hopefully that's interesting. It's probably further than I wanted to go into the musicality of it, but it is interesting to break that down. I mean, you know, our routine throughout the 90s of all those boy bands, you know, this became a production routine that was necessary, so that as E17 or Boyzone came in, we could say, right, we've got the session singer already singing the harmony parts. You go out and do this one individual harmony part, and then we've got the band on it as well. I know, you know, hence manufactured pop. You know, it sounds very manufactured, and it is a formula and it is a routine, but it works. You know, rather than having an artist come in and kind of struggle, what are we doing? What's the harmony? As a production team, we've already got it worked out. Do that. Learn it, go out and do it. And you know, most people could do that and could relate to that. So step 1, as I've shown you, you know, set up the lead vocal once you've got everything in. Step 2, a song pad or guitar to go with it. And in the book, I do describe how I would record an acoustic guitar, 2 mics and a DI signal, but we haven't got time to go through all of that today. Everything I've just described orally is right there for step 4 for the lead vocals. Double track lead, so step 5. So we're on, I believe we're on to step 6. Yeah, so quite simply, I'm going to keep coming down, get the rest of the keyboards in, get the guitars in, etc., etc. There's some interesting stories around the guitars and so on, until we get down to drums at the end. And, you know, for those of you that you might think you're getting a little bit tired now, by the time we get to the drums, you just want it to be over with. So that's what I mean. Psychologically, you're laying less importance in the overall mix to the drums. I'm not saying that drums are not important. I mean, obviously, especially if you've got live drums that you've recorded, there could be quite a lot of work to do. On this track, we've got programmed drums. if we've got time and we're all happy to carry on, I can show you some live drums that were recorded, well played but badly recorded. I won't say which college in America, but it'll be an example of this was an MA student in engineering and production recording a drummer on the performance course. And for me, as an experienced engineer, they made some classic mistakes. Because the thing is that always as a musician, in whatever you're doing, you're going to work to the track that you're given. And most of the track was finished by the time we sent the stems out to this young drummer, fantastic female drummer in America. But you should, as a professional musician, in my view, be able to say, right, okay, well, there's lots of guitars on there, there's lots of vocals, and the person recording should have given me the flexibility on every single drum, because it's safety first. You know, I don't mind if you're recording it flat, but to only put a couple of mics to cover a number of different drums that are set up makes it very difficult when you get to this stage of getting it all to work and get it into your mix and clearly hear everything that the drummer's playing. So if we get time, we'll come down to that. So, other keyboards. This is quite interesting, so I'll stay on the chorus.
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
Bring Belinda back in.
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
So we've got a typical 80s synth bell that's kind of helping the melody line along. And at various points, like now, I'm going to take vocals out so that you can hear. Very simple. And, you know, just out of interest, there's keyboards, a bit like that harmony I showed you, that I haven't used. We put on a piano all the way through. Perfectly good working with the other keyboards, but by the time I get to the guitars, you'll see, hopefully, why I haven't used that. I mean, you know, within our audio soundscape, there's only so much room for everything to fit together in a pop track like this. So now's a good time for me to talk about when we get down there to the drums. This was done with myself, that keyboard player that you just heard, Julian Wiggins, and a drum programmer, Simon Dalton. We worked together as a team called PJS. You know, my belief is that for pop songwriting and production, you need at least 3 people, probably 4, especially if you're doing songwriting, and it's all in the book. And my view is that you need someone leading that team. So in this situation, I'm the team leader. I described in my career earlier, Pete Waterman was the team leader at PWL. Tom Watkins was our team leader when we were doing E17. So you need a good musician keyboard player, and that person, Julian, great with backing vocals, you know, is a grade 8 musician, can instantly work out all the harmonies and so on. And I believe you need a different person for drums and percussion. That's my view. Many will disagree, many keyboard players disagree, but I think if you've got a specialist doing something that, you know, drums and percussion, which are so important, then it saves the keyboard player who's, you know, working on a lot of overall perspective, the work of having to program that as well. We have a local guitarist that kind of complements that 3-person team when we were working. We wanted to use him. I spoke to Belinda's manager, and he said, Belinda really wants you to use the guitarist in her band. Fine, no problem. How much is that person going to cost us compared to our local guitarist? And the budget was a lot higher. So, anyway, long story short, we cut a deal with the guitarist, and, you know, it's one of those things where you never quite know with someone you've not worked with before what are you going to get? I mean, obviously he's touring with Belinda, so he knows Belinda's style and everything. And not only did he send back a whole set of guitars, which I'm going to show you next, but he also gave me an organ, which I'm about to play to you, and he also gave me a bass guitar. So suddenly that kind of fairly what seemed high cost within a tight budget was more than justified by the amount of things that he sent back to me. So he put on this organ, which comes in at verse 2.
Cold and rain is hard, I know. Been that way for all my time.
So that came back typically as a stereo file. What have I done with it? Well, I've rolled out some bottom end up to 120 hertz. I've rolled out some of that low middle that I talked about earlier, 600 hertz, but it's been well recorded, so I haven't needed to boost any middle or top end. Whereas, just briefly going back to that bell, I've had to do some drastic EQ on that bell to bring out, you know, the more percussive front that I wanted. I mean, look how much I've rolled out. 500 hertz, I've rolled out 12 dB. If I bring that back in. Okay, so final thing on the keyboards before I move to the guitars. And again, if we get time, I'll show you later. This was originally came out in the 70s by a West Coast country rock band called Creedence Clearwater Revival. Look them up, they were a great band. And as was fairly typical for that genre, the song only contained a verse and a chorus. There's no bridge, there's no link, there's no solo, it's just verses and choruses. Looking at the style of Belinda back in the 80s, you know, this is how you have to be focused as a production team on what the record company have asked you to do. They've asked us to make a West Coast country rock song sound like Belinda Carlisle's Heaven is a Place on Earth in the 80s. And there's a lot more to that song arrangement than there is to the original song. So I said to the keyboard player, and this is an example of how far you can go sometimes, I said to our keyboard player, let's create an extra 8 bars to come at the intro and somewhere in the middle to give us, you know, like a relief section. And there's nothing to put there vocally, so we have to come up with a melody ourselves to put in. So that's what we did. Don't ask me what synth that was. Quite heavily EQ'd. And you see the similar EQ I'm using on things where I'm, you know, largely rolling out bottom end and low mid continually on these type of instruments, so that I'm leaving the space for those frequencies to the drums and the bass and the guitars. So, what better time to go to the guitars? Once the guitarist heard that, I'll play it to you one more time. And this was actually the last thing I listened to when the guitarist sent the files back, but I'll just show you what he sent me because it knocked me out. So he complimented that with slide. In 2 octaves. You know, I didn't ask him to do that. He just picked up on it as a musician and did it. You know, and that really, you know, from everything he sent, that was really the icing on the cake. So going back to what I just talked about, in terms of, you know, where does the song come from originally? Well, you know, that needed to be covered. I did request. So what happens when you, as a producer, you hire a musician, you give a certain amount of, I need this, this and this, i.e. must-haves, but please add whatever else you hear. So the slide wasn't a request, that's something he heard. One of my standard requests was, well, we need to tip a hat to the West Coast country rock. So that was obviously and that's very much when I play it later.
I know it's been coming
Acoustic guitars.
for some time.
And what he's given me is 3 guitar tracks. They were all stereo. I could tell he was a Logic user. So 1 hard left, 1 hard right. This time I've used the Focus D3 compressor. You know, if you invest in that Focusrite package, you get the D2 EQ and the D3 compressor. Can't recommend it highly enough. I'm not on any kind of kickback from Focusrite. You know, 3-to-1 ratio again. And just keeping it under control. So that's on all 3 acoustic guitars. And look, you know, again, yeah, I mean, you can tell on most things until we get down to drums and bass, you're going to keep seeing this shape of EQ. And I do love that all plug-in EQs give you a visual idea as well, you know, so it's kind of a psychological comfort. But interestingly, the rest of the guitars, I think he did ask me, you know, do you want everything flat and I put on the processing and effects, or should he do it? I will always say to a professional musician these days, you do it. Just you know, plug it in through your amp, get the sound that you think suits a track, and just send me that. So he did exactly that, and I've needed, wonderfully for me, no processing whatsoever on the guitars. But what I've done on the acoustics gives you an idea. And the next thing I asked him for specifically was 8s, chugging 8s, on an electric. All the way through, very 80s. And when we go back to hear Belinda Carlisle's Heaven is a Place on Earth, it's got that style of guitars on. So we're, from a production point of view, we've got all of that covered, as it were, for the client. But then the next thing that he did, which I didn't ask for, great guitarist. Wish I could remember his name. We'll give him a credit at the end. He's put himself. This is in my mind. I didn't actually ask him. He's almost put himself as like the 2 guitarists in the Rolling Stones on stage, playing off of each other. So around those basics that I've asked for, he's played a lot of licks that work with the vocals. And he's not done it once, he's done it twice. So I've got my 8 guitars panned half left and right, and these next 2 I'm going to show you are panned just a little bit further left and right.
And it's over, so they say it'll rain.
So he's playing in between the vocal lines.
I know, shining down like water.
Knowing that the 8s are behind him, keeping it all chugging. He's done it twice.
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain?
But they're not playing the same thing.
Coming down on a sunny day. Yesterday and days before, sun is cold and rain is hot. I know, man, that way.
And there they play the same.
Forever on it goes through the circle.
Fabulous. And everything we hear on them effect-wise is him with his pedals through his amp. I mean, digital pedals these days are so good that I think as a producer and engineer, you can actually rely on a musician saying, you know, I've got my pedal set up with my guitars, you know, and that's my sound. And then it's, you know, if you really want as an engineer and producer to get a dry sound that you can process afterwards, obviously you run a DI in the line. So you take a DI signal from the guitar, you can do your own, amp distortion and put your own effects on. But for me, 9 times out of 10, most musicians that are on the circuit and doing sessions and gigs have got their own setup and go with it. That's why you hire them. So there we go. One could say an orchestra of guitars.
Someone told me long ago, there's a calm before the storm. I know it's been coming for some time.
And that's, you can see now.
When it's over, so they say, it'll rain a sunny day. I know, shining down like water.
Hopefully you can see now why I haven't used the piano, because it's too much.
Someone told me long ago, there's a calm
I mean, he's not playing much,
before the
but
storm. I know, it's been coming for some time.
But for me, it's just too much in the stereo soundscape. Before we get on to bass and drums, we're almost there. So just quickly while we're there, it's quite rare that you get a piano track these days that's an acoustic piano. You've got a lovely acoustic piano out there. But I've got a system for both that works well, I think, for both acoustic pianos and grand piano sounds that are coming from plugins or various other things. Quite often it'll be sent to you as a stereo track, so you need to split mono. And what I'm trying to achieve here, because one of the things you have to decide as an engineer, certainly with drums, but I like to make the decision with piano as well. Are you the person playing, or are you the audience listening? Because your left and right goes the other way round. I like to be the person playing, whether it's drums, so in other words, my hi-hat's going to be left, etc., and I'll go around the kit like that. On a piano, I like to hear a clear definition that the bottom end is left-hand side and everything else is pushing to the right. So on this piano, I mean, he's not playing a huge amount for us to really make a good judgment. I've deliberately, on the left-hand side, cut top end and boosted bottom end at 144, 150. And by the way, I mean, you'll see it when we get to bass and drums as well. I've got this kind of general rule, and it's in the book, and I've got it as a diagram as well. For me, anyway, no boosting of bass above 150 hertz, and ideally, so things like this where I'm trying to boost the bass end, 150 hertz on the bass, 100 hertz on the kick, 50 hertz. So it's like I assign frequencies to instruments. And everything from kind of, 300 hertz to 900 hertz, as I've already said, I either leave it flat or cut it. I might as well carry on. 1K, 2K, maybe boosting some twang on the bass if the bass needs a bit more brightness, but pretty much nothing else because it's a harsh frequency to deal with. So until you get to 3K, now 3K, as we'll see when we get down to the kick, is great for boosting the slap on the kick. Yeah, and same, you can always relate these frequencies to an orchestra as well. So if you want to boost some brightness on a cello, I'd boost it at 3K. That's when I use 3K again. 4.5K, great for brightening guitars. I haven't needed to do it here particularly, a little bit on the acoustics. But if I'd have got all of those electric guitars flat to get that sound that he's given us through the amp, I would go in at 4.5K, something like that. Because I'm trying to save, as you saw earlier on, 5K and up to 10K for vocals, cymbals, bell, keyboards, things that are up there. So it's like, you can relate the whole frequency spectrum to different instruments. I mean, obviously, you're never going to affect something 100%, but in terms of emphasising that. And what I found by using that kind of system is when you've got a lot of things going on in a track like this, you're trying to give everything a frequency area that it's operating in. You're trying to give it processing reverb areas, you know, because the whole idea of the stereo soundscape in pop, and I like to say that a lot of Ed Sheeran records are a great example of it, is, you know, people want the voice there, the lead voice there. And generally, behind that lead voice in the central position, okay, you might have kick, snare and bass, but pretty much everything else should be like a 3D dimensional soundscape behind it. Hence, you see the panning and the reverbs I've been doing, and trying to get everything not affecting that centre lead voice too much. You know, and they do that great I think on the Ed Sheeran records. You know, Ed, I can't believe he still goes out just guitar and him, but certainly on the first two albums, that was how people related to him. Ed's voice, Ed's guitar. You listen to those first two albums, obviously people have said, you know, we can't make two albums just exactly as you do live with just guitar and voice. We've got to have something going on behind it to complement it, to be able to market it worldwide. So you listen to those first two albums, and that's exactly what they've got. Ed's there, his guitar's kind of there, and all the other things are spread out around him. And it's a very good example of you know, the kind of process and soundscape that I've gone for here and generally would go for. So, how did I get into that? Left-hand side of the piano. I was talking EQ, wasn't I? So we've got plus 3.5 at 150 hertz, and we're cutting at 3K and drastically at 9K to bring out the left-hand side, the bottom end, in other words. And then hopefully we complement that with the right-hand side, fully panned left and right. Sounds a bit much on its own. Almost the opposite. You know, I'm cutting up to 150 hertz, I'm cutting at 600 hertz, I'm boosting at 5 and 8. You put the two together, and you've got quite a wide stereo separation, as though you're I feel like I'm playing it in the centre position. So yeah, shame we haven't used that piano, but there just wasn't room for it on the track. But that's
Can I just say that's a really incredible tip as well, especially as you've got a piano here to work with. Since I've read that in the book, because it never occurred to me to treat the left-hand side of a piano and the right-hand side of a piano differently. I'd always, if I got a stereo file, I'd just process the stereo file. If I had two mics, I'd bus them to a stereo.
Exactly.
And process the whole piano.
And it's worth, on a real piano, I think, in the same as I described, like three things for an acoustic guitar, one on the whole, one on the body, plus a DI signal, to give you all the choice possible in here. It's worth going three mics on a piano, I think, because then you've got the option to the mic that's over the low strings, pan hard left, the mic that's over the middle strings, up the middle, and the mic towards the top end strings to the right. And I mean, it's pretty drastic EQ, as you heard there on the right-hand side, but it doesn't sound that drastic when you play it with the other side. So, but it does work on acoustic piano as well, maybe not quite as drastic as I've shown you there.
Can I ask a little question?
Yeah.
It's the biggest challenge with piano, because it covers so much of the frequency spectrum in one instrument.
Yeah.
You're always fighting that decision as to what you're going to...
Exactly. I mean, I did a track recently that, as far as I was concerned, it was acoustic guitar based. And I had, you know, other electric guitars and all sorts on there. And then my wonderful ex-partner, Ian Kerno, put some piano on. And a bit like I demonstrated with the guy that's played guitar around the voice, instead of Ian playing piano like this, where the guy's just doing the basic chords, because he hadn't heard the voice yet, he's just keeping the basic chords down. Ian played around the vocal on the piano. So almost every time the singing is there, and then when there's a space there, because not many other, you know, guitars were just strumming along, he'd fill the space. And suddenly it became like a wonderful instrument to put in. But I would have treated it exactly like that, as I've just shown you, because by the time we ended up on the track. You know, it ended up with drums and bass and more electric guitars and so on. But the piano became integral by what he was playing as well as how I treated it. Yeah. So that's why I've talked about like a project overall rather than just, you know, a hardcore mix that I've done that someone else has recorded, and I don't know the history of the recording. You know, here I can give you the history of everything as well. And if you've got that as a person that's mixing, then obviously you've got fantastic knowledge of how it's all come together. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you get something you haven't recorded, you can actually dive into the mix with a lot more of an open mind and be a lot more, shall we say, drastic. I mean, I've made decisions here for myself as I've gone along, but that's almost easier to do sometimes on something you haven't recorded, you know, and you can say, no, that's not necessary. I mean, I've done it ever since the 80s, and generally, you know, when I would mix something for Stock Aitken Waterman and I'd be leaving this out and that out, I don't think ever once anyone turned around and said, well, why didn't you use that, Phil? You know, because the thing is, you're looking to get the whole track gelling together and working and pleasing whoever the main client was. So if I've done a mix and there's a playback with all of us there, if Pete Waterman was happy, who's the captain of the ship that we're all working towards, I'm not saying everyone lived in fear of him, but generally, if he's happy, then everyone else is saying, well, if Pete's happy, that's it. I won't worry about that sequencer that I spent hours on, you know, that Phil hasn't used in the mix. But, you know, that's the way it goes. I mean, I do talk about it in the book. I consider what we're in a service industry. What you're moving into is a service industry, you know, almost like, you know, being in a kitchen. That's a great example of a mega service industry where everyone's in the kitchen saying, yes, chef, no, chef, as we see on recent TV things. But whoever your client is in whatever project you're doing, no budget, low budget, high budget, that is the person that we, as a creative technical team in whatever our role is trying to please. And that's because if you do that, you get beyond stage one. You know, beyond the stage of pleasing whoever your client is, it's then, you know, goes, if your client is not the artist, it then goes to the artist, the record company, the manager, and then it's got to go to all the media. And then what I'm saying is a lot of barriers to cross before our work as creative people behind a record get to the punters. So that's why it's to me, it's a service industry. And you know, another example at the far end of the scale, I know I've gone off of this for a second, you know, you look at someone like Sir Paul McCartney, he realises it's a service industry. He wouldn't dare go out and do a concert with fans paying God knows how much money these days and not play a selection of Beatles tracks because he knows that's what people want. You know, so he's servicing the people that have paid that ticket to come in and to see him and his band, you know. So it's worth bearing that in mind because a lot of people can get lost, a bit like I was describing with an unused sequencer part. It's easy when you're spending hours and days on something to get lost in the minutiae of the project, you know, and you've got to learn to let that go. In other words, you know, in a drastic way, leave your ego outside the door. I mean, I learned that in the early days, you know, to my detriment, because I was playing in bands and I was working under a wonderful producer called Gus Studgeon, who produced Elton John, and I would see him, you know, and I was, you know, 17 or 18 at the time, taking control of the session. You know, it was total control, a bit like I was describing Pete Waterman. You know, if it didn't work for Gus's ears, you keep working at it. You keep working. I mean, I've seen him, you know, I used to see him in there with bass players, like for 10 hours, getting a bass part right until Gus said it was right. So, and it's easy to sort of look at that and take that on yourself and think, oh, that's the way it works. But actually, what I've learned across time is it's a lot more about compromise and a lot more about servicing the client. And that's the environment you're going to find yourselves working in. So bear that in mind. Right, we're on to the bass. So the guitarist has delivered me this bass. Before this, we had a program bass that was bom, 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 bom. It just, you know, it was playing what those guitars are playing, but as a sequence bass. What I would have liked, technically, for him to deliver is that's a DI signal. I would have liked to have heard an amp signal as well, because it sounds, without my processing on, very plain, you know. It's okay, but, you know, you can tell it's not an amp. And whereas he's got all those wonderfully amped guitars, electric guitars going on. So here we go. So I've gone 2-to-1 ratio on the bass for the first time on any compressor on the project. So I'm keeping him under control there. But, you know, whether it's this or another amp processor, you know, this Sans amp processor comes generally, or we did, with Pro Tools free. And it's just allowing me to sort of amplify this a little bit. Obviously, I don't want to go that far. And I can tell when I take that off, he's playing with a pick, which again is, you know, yeah. If I was with him, I probably would have said fingers. Yeah, fingers. But anyway. And, you know, let's quickly get down to the drums to see, you know, why has he played that rhythm? Well, not only is it very similar to the original record in terms of Creedence Clearwater Revival. So, you know, so we've ended up with a combination of a little bit of influence from the original record and a lot of influence from Heaven is a Place on Earth from Belinda, you know, and doing these kind of comparisons and, you know, influences drives the way a final pop record works. And that's generally the way most pop songwriters and producers work, which is why so many records sound so similar in this genre. And classically, he's gone exactly with a bass drum. Okay, so what did we do for drums? Decided to have programmed drums. We went straight to the Abbey Road 80s drums, you know, and with In Contact and that whole package. And it's brilliant. You know, the Abbey Road engineers have recorded it, they've processed it, as it says on the box, 80s. So a very clean bass drum, and I'll show you what that's like. But with this one, the snare with a wonderful 80s ambience, which I've done absolutely nothing to. These Pultec equalisers are wonderful within the whole Universal Audio setup. Again, you know, all of their plugins. Every day that I walked in to do a mix at PWL Studios, the assistant would have a Pultec already over the kick drum and another one over the snare drum. And although it was all programmed, it was all in drums, you know, this was our secret weapon to really, you know, making it kick through on the radio. So if I take this out before I describe what I've put in, we go a fraction louder for a second. There are some EQs that are just like, oh, yeah, I've got to have some of that. And and again, I mean, obviously, if that was a hardware unit, it would have even more edge to it. But it's still, you know, Universal Audio done a brilliant job. So yeah, it's quite drastic. I'm going in at 60 dB. The sample, to my ears, you know, before I did this, here it's pretty clicky. It's already had a lot of that low boxy mid that I've talked about taken out of it. To my ears. So I've gone in 8 dB at 60 hertz. As I said, I'm saving 50 or 60 hertz for a kick drum earlier on. And to get the slap back into it by putting so much bottom end in, I've got 6 dB boost at 3K. I mean, I could probably live these days more like that, because I've grown to hate that 80s slap, bright kick bass. I've presented a whole conference paper on it. But unfortunately, people are still doing it. We stopped in a while from the 90s onwards, but there's been so much kind of throwback to 80s music and 80s sounds. Yeah, I hate it. The thing is that, you know, whether it's what I'm doing or whether it's what was already on there, you know, you stand in front of a live kick drum, it doesn't sound like that. You know, it doesn't sound anywhere near as... You might get some of that click if you're the drummer. You know, the click is obviously the pedal hitting the skin. But no, I've grown to find it annoying. But nevertheless, this was an 80s project, so we kept it there. And there's really not too much else. I've already described the snare. Programmed hi-hat over on the left-hand side as though I'm the drummer. And whether it's live drums or programmed drums, I'll nearly always say to the programmer, well, now, purely for a stereo EQ balance, give me a capacitor or shaker on the right-hand side. I mean, I know it sounds quite mechanical, but to me, it's a kind of a technical thing with your ears that you don't want to be listening to a track where it feels lopsided, you know. So that will always happen for me. And yeah, I mean, it's the Abbey Road 80s drums come with, you know, with good sounds, but I've still boosted 6K at 10K for that hi-hat just to bring that out. And I would normally, I mean, if it was live drums, within the hi-hat, within the overheads, I'd be drastically cutting that low mid that I've talked about, you know, between 300 and 900, because all that spill of the other drums onto your cymbals, unless you're comfortable with it, you know, can sound a bit much. But, you know, as you saw on the bass, you know, I'm not taking any of that low mid out. So, you know, what my hope is that boxy low mid is naturally there in the kick and the bass, and to me that's all you need on the record. You know, and I haven't cut it on the guitars either. You know, that's my advice. And then we've got a bunch of toms. And you might think, well, why is that constant tom there? Well, when we dissected Heaven is a Place on Earth, the drums actually all the way through the track. And just to prove that, we've got it here to show you. I would never generally ask anyone to play that or program that, but there it is on that record, and so we're tipping our hat to it. You can hear those 8's electric guitars, similar sort of snare sound to what we've got there. I mean, we're pretty much there.
There's a place on earth, they say.
That's a lot of stuff going on before we get to the verse, you know, in that original record. I mean, you know, to me, having done this sort of thing a lot of the time, I don't think, I will play in a minute, the Creedence has got a chorus at the front, but it was a classic 80s trick. It's been discarded for almost 20 years. You listen to some pop records now and it's gradually coming back, where you get a taster of the chorus at the front. It was almost like, people have rejected it for 20 plus years, but suddenly BTS did it with Coldplay, and it's like, well, if it's all right, Coldplay, to have a chorus at the front, then maybe it's okay for the rest of us to start doing that. I don't know. So anyway, our record, to try and match that, so we start with the chorus. Same as Heaven is a Place on Earth.
Coming down on a sunny day. Someone told me long ago.
So that's great, because if I go back now to Creedence, we're almost finished, people. If I play Creedence from the start. And we decided not to use that, even though it's a classic. It just...
told me long ago.
Dun, 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 dun. We debated long and hard, should we use that? Because to people that love the original record, it's an integral part of it. But our focus was sounding like Belinda in the 80s, as the client wanted, and we're, as I've explained, servicing the client. So... so that extra melody that we've added, the breakdown chorus that you've heard at the front there, puts us where we need to be.
I wanna know, have you ever seen the rain coming down on a sunny day?
As an extra to build that second verse, typical production trick. There were harmonies that we missed in that first verse, got them in now.
Forever on it goes, through the circle fast and slow. I know it can't stop, I wonder. I know.
Yeah. That was very much it, job done. Belinda was delighted with it, record company was delighted with it. Not only did it appear on the South American album, Belinda's put it onto her greatest hits album, so she was obviously pleased with it. And my understanding is that she does it in her live set as well. So she wanted to do the song. We at the start of the whole project, we were given, there were 3 or 4 different production teams working on it. Here's a list of artists that we think will say yes. Here's a list of 60s and 70s, mainly what they call evergreen songs, that we don't think have been covered in an 80s style. And it was like, pick an artist, pick a song, match them up, and if the artist wants to do it, we'll do it. So we did Long Train Running with Curiosity Killed the Cat. We did Hot Stuff with Samantha Fox. Those are the 3 main tracks that we did. But there were other, classic tracks and if you're into the 80s artists you would have heard about. I wanted to do I wanted to do, but it was too late. I mean, he was still alive. The guy from Dead or Alive, you know, the wonderful Pete Burns. I wanted him to do the classic Donna Summer, I Feel Love. And I think it would have worked really well, but his band partner, Steve, Dead or Alive, just said unfortunately he was too ill to do it. But and I mentioned that because I had a vision in my mind of, you know, a Dead or Alive Spin Me Round backing track with Pete Burns singing I Feel Love over the top of it, and I really think it could have worked. And that's, you know, a lot of the time certainly in the production field, but also, you know, if you're songwriting as well, it's kind of you as a producer or as a songwriter, you've got to have a vision. And my belief is before you walk into the studio to do a project, that vision should be in your mind. So again, I talk about this in here. You know, and if you study, as I have done, you know, quite a lot of heavy academia and people talking about creativity and the making and production of records, there's a lot of terminology that you pick up and you think, okay, yes, I can relate that to what I'm saying. So I like to call that sonic pictures. Other people use other terms, but you know, literally, for this record, I could see Belinda singing this song in the style of Heaven and Earth, and I could visualise the whole picture before we started, and then it becomes a case of like painting by numbers. We need the guitarist to do this. We need the drums to do this. You know, we need backing vocals to do that. You know, all the elements of Heaven is a Place on Earth. So it's not always going to be the case, but I think if you walk into a project, whether it's production or mixing or whatever, if you walk in with that pretty clear vision, you'll have a good chance of coming out with a successful project. If you walk in with a blurred vision, in my humble view, many people do, you know, the polite term is to say to be organic. In other words, to go in on a project and just see how it grows organically with the band or with the musicians. That works for a lot of producers and a lot of engineers and a lot of people, but I've never found that particularly works for me. You know, and maybe that's my grounding going back to Gus Dudgeon, you know, producer of Elton John and those fantastic records. That, you know, that was not just Elton walking in and just, you know, jamming with the band and Gus recording it. You know, there were strong visions between Gus and Elton. Not that I witnessed those, I only ever witnessed the mixes because they used to mix at the Marquee. But yeah, there was a strong vision there that I mean, when I was an assistant, we mixed the whole of the Captain Fantastic Dirk Brown Cowboy album, and not once did Elton come in. That's how much he trusted Gus to, you know, Gus has recorded it all. It all sounded great when he recorded it. He came in on the last day for an album playback. I was, you know, quivering as a young fan almost, you know, how do you take your tea, Elton, and so on. And he sat in the middle seat. Obviously, it was up on the big speakers. Didn't say a word. Allowed the whole side one and side two to play through, and turned around to Gus, and just, you know, fantastic, Gus, sounds great. Walked out and that was it. I mean, compared to what we get these days, where you're on, you know, mix 5, mix 6, you know, by the time you're on mix 10, and all the band have heard it and everyone, it's like, oh my God, you know, where do you pull out as a producer or a mixer of how many mixes and changes you can keep doing? So, you know, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but you know, I'd say we got to mix 3 on here. And that was just to please executive producer Robin. We didn't get any negative feedback from Belinda, her management, or the label. Any further questions? You've been, I know some people have had other things to go off to. Yes.
I just have a quick question.
Yep.
So you mentioned at the beginning how you started out being like a coffee boy doing errands.
Yeah.
And I've talked to other industry professionals that also started that way. Is that still the case, would you say? Like, you have to start from the bottom?
If you're determined to get into not even a major, any music studio or music environment, it is still the case that you may well start off in that type of position. But generally what I see at places like Abbey Road, the Strong Room, where I was, and so on, they will take on a graduate, someone like yourself graduating from this course, and instead of expecting you to do that for the 4 or 5 years that I did, because they'll expect that you understand Pro Tools, you understand the studio environment, all the learning and knowledge that you've picked up here. And certainly the system that I've seen at the Strong Room is that you will be taken on for 6 months in that position. If they then see the potential in you after 6 months that you can help another engineer or producer run a studio, run everything, and I've got great knowledge, and most importantly, 70% of their decision will be, do you fit into the environment? Our clients saying he was great or she was great, and next time they come in, they want to work with you. So that's where it goes. So they'll make a decision after. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. Typically, it can last 6 months. Maybe other places like Metropolis and so on, slightly different. But what I would say is those are the most difficult UK environments to get into, and a much better situation is what James did with Mark, to find someone that's probably running their own studio somewhere and can actually do with some help. Now, how do you go about finding that person? Often it can be down to luck, but there are some basic things you can do, like the Music Week directory that comes out once a year, gives a full listing of producers, their managers and studios. And what I would say is that if you're patient enough and determined enough, hopefully you'll find someone somewhere that you'll click with and will give you a chance. Maybe just a couple of weeks' work experience to start with, and you move on from there. So that's, when I'm asked that question, that's generally my advice. I mean, even more positive than that, ideally, as I've described earlier, is to do your own thing. If you don't feel ready to do that, fine. But in terms of, working with your peers on a course like this and other people you meet, can you form a team? Like I've talked about, you've got to home in on what your key skills are. What is it? Are you a musician as well as a technician?
Yeah, I produce.
You produce mainly, but you play some instruments?
I play the cello.
You play the cello, right, okay. So it sounds like you need to collaborate with musicians, so I would say if you were to go forward, you may well not want to, but others may have this in mind. If you want to go forward and try and form a professional songwriting and production team in the pop world, I would say that you need someone that can program drums, like we've seen here, someone that is a grade 8 keyboard musician that's into programming, like we've seen here. That's already 3 of you. The missing element then, in terms of songwriting, either for people asking you or you presenting them, is what we call a top liner. So someone that does the lyrics and the melody. And to me, that's an ideal 4-person team. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of money coming in for a 4-person team to set themselves up and survive right now in the industry. But if you can, certainly if you can make it and crack it that way, you're not leaning on anything else other than yourselves as a team. You've got to find, as we were talking about earlier, you've got to find your route. You've got to find, like I'm saying, what's your key skill and where are you going, and what do you need to achieve that? And it most likely isn't going to be what I've just described. It could be an entirely different area. You may want to get into sound design, writing for film, etc., etc. If you play cello, you may have, the idea of doing classical and orchestral or contemporary way of combining that. I am pleased that certainly many musicians these days have found a way through the tricky environment that we are in as a music industry. In some ways, I think it's easier for production and creative technical people and engineers to use their transferable skills and go into anywhere where there's audio. My co-vice chair of J.A.M.E.S, Dennis Weinrich, has been in the film world. He's been the audio post director of Pinewood Studios, and in the last 10, 20 years, he said, you walk onto an average film set being shot in the UK and you will find many music technology and production technology students that have come off of a music course actually working on the floor in the film world because they've been able to adapt their skills to the technology required there. You know, here we are with these guys are audio specialists, but they've developed into filming as well. And, you need to diversify. And as a musician, what I always say to musicians is if you've been on a performance course or you've been to a conservatoire or something like that, you've got to embrace technology. Because out there in many different genres are producers and people like myself that want to hire you. But we may not be able to afford to be in a wonderful studio like this. So therefore, you've got to be able as a professional musician to receive stems and tracks off of someone like myself, record yourself and professionally send it back, exactly like we've seen the guitarist. You know, I spoke to him once, never met him in my life, and what a fantastic job he's done, you know.
Can we have that particular soundbite back? So we can send
Certainly, certainly. And there's not enough students on performance courses that kind of grasp that, you know. And one of my sort of classic stories in Bury St Edmunds is I helped the music department at a local school. We saw in a 13-year-old girl the potential of her playing drums while we were away on a musical retreat. So she started. She took lessons, she grew and grew and grew, and she's now a professional musician touring the world with the Pet Shop Boys. You know, it can't, you know, she's still only sort of mid-20s, so it can't, you know, but tremendous determination that she was going to be a professional drummer no matter what, you know.
And can I just add, do you know the non-tech courses like music performance that we have here as well? They now, because of the advice from Phil, actually, particularly related to his work with our accredited Sir J.A.M.E.S, we've introduced the first module that every course does is a basic studio techniques module. That's why all the other courses, not just the tech courses, now all have to. It was a bit of pushback on it, but it really pays off now.
Yeah.
Really worth it.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, it's absolutely vital for a professional musician. Yeah, because she, she studied, all the way through to this level. You know, finished her course, and no one had talked about technology. I won't say where it was, and people started coming to her because she appeared on a thing with Goldie on TV about going around the country and putting, young musicians together to form a band, and people started saying, "Oh, can I send you my stems and what's your price?" And she had nothing. She had to come round to me and, with a laptop and well, you need to buy Logic and you need to buy a set of mics to mic your drums up, and she's gone from there. Sorry, James, yeah.
Just a quick question. So at the very start, you said that in general, when you start a project like this, you'd set your vocal as kind of your unity.
In terms of the mix, yeah.
It's a very common thing when people are mixing not only pop but anything, that you're constantly battling the headroom in a DAW.
Yeah.
So when you're mixing the drums, you turn that up. Oh, I need to put the bass in. Better turn the drums down. Blah blah blah. So on and so on. Do you find that when you set the vocal at 0 when you start, you can only go downwards from there in terms of volume? Because maybe in pop in particular, you want the vocal as the main.
Yeah. Well, ideally, but interestingly, my main lead vocal has ended up at plus 1.6.
Right.
I mean, it's not much,
Do you find things just slot in under it by setting that at the start? That's kind of your
exactly,
ceiling. Yeah. You can't really go above that.
I mean, in the various steps that I've gone through on the 12 steps, probably the only time I actually take the vocal out is by the time I'm down at bass and drums, because I want to know that the vocal is still sitting on top of the keyboards and the guitars and so on. And, it should be obvious, really, like the piano and some other bits, when something's not working and it's not really... it's all about supporting the vocal. Sure. That's the point. And it was classic. When I did Stay Another Day, it was... that's when I kind of started this system. I couldn't get everything in. On the final mix, I'd got all my 60 vocal tracks sorted out, all working with the keyboards, all working with the masses of orchestration that Ian had programmed. And then I got the keyboards in the orchestration working with the bass and the drums that we had, which was a kind of insistence on the Tony, the band leader and songwriter. But when I put the vocals back in with all of that, it was a mess. So I delivered a mix because I was going off on holiday the next day, without the drums and without the bass, thinking, okay, I'll show everyone what we've got vocally and the great orchestration and the wonderful keyboards and everything. And when I come back from holiday, I'll mix the bass and drums in when I'm fresher, because it was like 2 a.m. or something. And I came back and booked the studio to do that. And the manager said, don't you dare touch a thing. Everybody's sold on what we have. And that is the record as we still know it. But we had on there, and they've never been heard, these sort of Phil Collins type drums. And a bass. Can't remember what the bass was doing, but it was. I was pleased, to say the least. But sometimes you got to. If something's impossible to balance, you've just got to make some drastic decisions. Sure. Sometimes, you know. But the worst case scenario in pop is you don't have enough, and that would sometimes happen. It never happened in the 90s because you know, Ian Kernow was a keyboard player and co-producer that would know that I'd want more rather than less. But sometimes when Stockake and Waterman were in a project and, you know, they were forever flitting between projects and wanting to move on, sometimes there wouldn't be enough on there, you know, and I'd be in a separate studio downstairs and I'd have to drag someone like Matt Aitken down and say, well, we need more keyboards and we need some more drums. So things like that. But yeah, that's the worst case scenario for someone like me, is that you haven't got enough to fill the audio spectrum that you visualised, or even if you're only visualising it when you come in to do the mix.
So when you were talking about the sort of clicky,
kick drum,
80s kick drum,
God, yeah.
which has come back,
yeah,
for whatever reason, the 80s sound is coming back, whether it's materialising through synthwave elements or through, like you're looking at collaborations with like Dua Lipa and Elton John and going back.
Yeah,
Why do you think this way of recording and this way of writing is lasted so long? And why does it always come back? It's over 40 years ago.
Well, there's nothing that I would disagree with or complain about from those type of records other than the kick. And part of that reason is, and one of the reasons I, you know, did a whole presentation with someone more technical than myself, is that the route that got us to that clicky kick drum no longer exists. And the route was, in the early 80s, was the invention of the Linn drum, you know, which instantly came with these pre-recorded, quite clicky kicks, but, you know, good sounding drums. I mean, you know, once Stevie Wonder did a whole album with it, everyone was like, oh, bloody hell, I've got to have a Linn drum, you know. And then the second phase of it comes down to the SSL. So on the SSL EQ, and again, not many people like to talk about this because the SSL E series is considered classic. Engineers like myself at the time hated it, and it took years for us to persuade SSL to make it smoother. It was kind of, you know, I don't want to diss SSL too much because they're still, you know, got friends there and they're still a huge worldwide company. But, you know, they're based in Oxford in England. They listen to us, but it was almost like it was built as a console to compete with Neve. You know, and I'm bringing it down to real basics here, that Neve would have a very wide EQ band, very smooth. So SSL said, well, you know, there's disco, there's dance records, there's pop, so we'll make it all very kind of, you know, narrow and harsh. That's how it sounded to a lot of us. Most people felt that was great for pop, but so on the EQ, when you got to the EQ on the desk, you know, you've always got you know, an amount and an EQ setting. So the high mid setting was 3K. So one of the conclusions that myself and the other guy came to was that lazy engineers would say, oh, we need and the reason for a clicky drum sound was to make it come through transistors. We were still listening to a lot of records on transistor radios, on, you know, not high quality systems and high quality car like we have now. So the idea that the requirement kind of came from producers was, well, I want the bass drum to really come through even on a transistor. So we can go back to the Oratone speakers, which people think are classic. And I mean, I can't believe. When I see NS10s or an Oratone in a studio, I'm put off.
I was just about to mention this.
I am put off because if people are seriously still listening to records on an Oratone, which was meant to sort of duplicate a vaguely high quality transistor radio, it's like so we'd have these Oratones, and quite often we'd come down to one mono one, so it sounds like a transistor, and you'd balance and EQ your kick to come through on that, and that's why I said earlier it's lost all reality from standing in front of a bass drum or what a bass drum really sounds like. So it's almost like it's an element to me, the 80s kick sound, that is removed from reality of what drums are. It's almost like so it's a percussive thing. And the first time, you know, when I discovered this in recent years, I used to work with a great Latin pop band called Matt Bianco, you know, and it was all Linn drum, and we had everything that I've just described kind of set up, and they did treat the bass drum like Latin percussion. You know, generally their bass drum pattern will be ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. And so there was a re-release about, 6-7 years ago, and the record company wanted me to write some liner notes for the CD re-release. So I put the CD on a car journey. I thought, well, I'll listen to the whole album. By the time I finish my journey in an hour's time, I'll have something to write. At the end of the journey, all I could hear was ba-boom, ba-boom, and way too much 3K and click on it, which is me. That's me putting it on. And I didn't have a word to say about it other than, what were we doing? What were we doing? What were we thinking? And so now when I hear it, and in that demonstration, you know, not only could I pick out something like that and the PWL record, but you listen to a Duran Duran record, all kinds of early 80s records with this really clicky kick that is nothing to do with a kick drum. So back to the start of your question, so why are people copying that? Because, well, that's how it sounded back then, and they're doing ABs like I've just shown you between, you know, Heaven is a Place on Earth and what we're doing now, and thinking, oh, that's how our kick drum should sound. Yeah.
That's why we have NS10, so Phil can come in.
And never use them. Never use them. I didn't go to them once. Yeah. So I need to write that paper up and actually get more people involved in what is quite a lonely journey to try and stop people doing it. But it's 3K, and on the Dua Lipa and other records, I can hear it. It's people are boosting 3K or taking a sample, you know, like this that's already got a lot of, to me, you know, 3K on it, because that was yeah. But there's various reasons that were all not necessarily the right reasons for how it ended up sounding.
Interestingly, that album that had all those sounds on it was called Future Nostalgia, which is quite interesting in itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. Yes, if I had the power to stop people doing it, I would, but I don't.
Well, perhaps we could talk to Avid, and they could, as soon as you label a channel kick, it just notches out 3K.
Yeah.
Nothing you can do
Yeah.
with it.
I mean, in the Matt Bianco case I've talked about, I've said to mastering engineers who are remastering for that re-release, can you cut 3K? But the thing is, you're going to cut so many things out by cutting 3K from a mix as opposed to an individual kick, you know, unless you go back to the original files, you know. Yeah.
Although there's sort of AI enhanced things. I can bring a vocal up by about 3 dB in a track these days, and you'd never know it wasn't done from the multi-track. It's getting really, the software's getting really clever.
Yeah. So maybe AI will do it for me. Yeah.
Yeah. That's it.
One day.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much for those that have hung in to the end. Thank you.